What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another Kerbal Space Program video. And in today's Kerbal Space Program video, we're going to be going to the Mun in an SSTO, which is entitled the Duna Phantom X, because I saw a post on Reddit of an entertaining-looking Blunderbirds mission, but sadly the guy never got back to me. So I messaged another guy who also then never got back to me. So we got this. It was intended to be a Duna SSTO to rescue a large number of Kerbals from the surface of Duna. That mission might still happen, but this week I thought I may as well take it on a test run to a slightly more local body, and that body being the Mun, of course. The other reason I thought it might be a cool time to take an SSTO to the Mun is because NASA recently announced that they would be accepting designs for their next generation of Mun lander. So NASA, if you're watching, here you go. I know rockets can be expensive and you are very under budget and years behind with the SLS, so I thought, how about I show them the light that is the single stage to orbit, and they could just build this craft and it will work. I'm 59% sure it will work. And you know, it's been proven that SSTOs are just as easy to build in real life as they are in Kerbal Space Program. Irrefutably, it's been proven using science. And of course, you know, with SSTOs, you can use them over and over and over again, and it'll save NASA a lot of money. So guys, thank you. I have solved NASA's moon landing problem. Next week, we're going to tackle the climate crisis, but this week it's going to be, you know, landing on the moon. This bears quite a bit of resemblance to my other Phantom line of SSTOs. I used to do this, well, I guess I still do. I used to name my SSTOs after kind of the fuselage. If it was just a Mark 1 fuselage, they had the Dune class naming. Mark 2 fuselages were Phantom class. Mark 3 fuselages were Argus class. And then Trimaran Mark 3 fuselages in like 3 fuselages all in a row was the Artemis class. So this is kind of reminiscent of the old Duna class SSTOs I used to build. Phantom class SSTOs designed for Duna that I used to build, but I think it has some nice optimization to make it a little bit better. For example, it has space for 4 extra Kerbals, whereas the highest capacity the previous Phantom SSTOs could carry was only 6. Now we've got room for a whopping 10. So it could double as a good tourist passenger craft for anyone that wanted a good tourist craft, although the tourist missions are generally, you know, earlier on in the career mode playthrough. If by the time you've got the rapiers and stuff needed to make this craft, you probably don't need to worry about tourist missions, but I guess it's still a fun thing to do nonetheless. Now you can see me placing those, well, I've already placed them now, but I placed those Werner engines on the underside of the cockpit, and that is because, again, this was designed for flight at Duna, where the atmosphere is very tenuous, and landing can be quite difficult without your nose diving too far into the ground. So the Werner engines are a godsend when it comes to maintaining a steady landing path. The other thing I've added, which isn't necessary for a Mun landing, are lots and lots of air brakes, which aren't really needed for the Mun because there's no atmosphere, and Kerbin's atmosphere is thick enough to not need them when we come to our final Kerbin re-entry. The main thing I've added, though, is lots of parachutes. Parachutes are almost essential for Duna SSTO landings because it can take a while to slow down, and when you're landing on bumpy terrain that is Duna, you want to be able to slow down as quickly as possible, so that's what the parachutes were for. And I do use them in this video, albeit accidentally, and lots of fun drama ensues. The final re-entry the final flight towards the Kerbal Space Center runway does involve some accidental parachute deployment, so the craft is not the most gracious landing coming up. Spoiler alert. But here we go. Nevertheless, we're going to fire up the Rapier engines and get ready to begin our ascent, which is very, very easy in this craft. It's steady as a rock, so hopefully if you downloaded the craft file from the description, you should have no problems flying it. But the first we're going to do, like I say, is fire up the Rapiers using Action Group 1 and just coast our way down towards the sort of three-quarters of the way along the runway. We're just going to keep a steady pitch, not going to try pitching up just yet. And then once we've picked up enough speed, about 90 meters per second or more, we're going to start gradually pitching up. Obviously, you don't want to be too aggressive with pitching up because you'll just slam the nuclear engines into the ground and explode them. And, you know, we probably don't want to be destroying nuclear reactors in this close proximity to the Kerbal Space Center. Now, from there, we're going to hold a fairly steady pitch. I'm trying to get a bit of altitude, but I'm not trying to be too aggressive because at this point in the mission, we're not trying to gain too much height. So I'm going to hold, at the moment, a 10-degree pitch, but we will start to flatten out as we get faster and faster. you really want to try and get to about 450 meters per second before you attempt the actual main ascent. So now we've reached 1 kilometer above sea level. I'm now going to start gradually getting closer and closer to the prograde marker. I say that I'm still holding 10 degrees, but once we stop accelerating, I'm going to gradually start pitching down to get a nice flat. There we go, pitching down now to get our trajectory nice and flat to try and pick up as much speed as possible. The closer you are to the prograde marker on the nav ball, the less your aerodynamic drag will be. Obviously, the prograde marker at this point is dipping a little bit too much down, so we don't want to start losing height. So I'm going to be holding a flat trajectory here to try and get the best of both worlds. We're trying to minimize our aerodynamic profile, but also, you know, not cause a descent. And there we have passed the 450 meters per second barrier, which means that the rapiers are now at full thrust, so we can start beginning our ascent. As you can see, our surface velocity rapidly rising there. I'm not going to go for a too aggressive ascent because we don't want to, you know, it's trying to find that compromise, isn't it, of trying to gain height but also trying to accelerate. And I find sort of 20 degrees at this point in the mission is a good compromise. As we reach the 10 kilometer mark, we're going to start flying again closer and closer to prograde, trying to pick up as much speed as possible because the rapiers have two there's some nice quick round cockpit shots. They have two firing modes. They have a closed cycle, which uses oxidizer and liquid fuel, and a much more efficient air breathing mode by using the oxygen from the atmosphere rather than oxidizer from fuel tanks. So we want to try and get as much speed as we can with the rapiers in the air breathing mode before considering switching to closed cycle. And then once I hit about 20 kilometers, I'm going to fire up the nuclear engines as well, just to provide some extra thrust. Once I sensed that the rapiers were about to kind of flame out, they were running out of air, we can switch their firing mode using action group 2 to closed cycle, holding a slightly more aggressive angle attack to try and focus on raising our apoapsis to a satisfactory height, because once those rapiers run out of fuel, we're only going to have the nuclear engines to power us through. And 2 nuclear engines for a craft with this amount of dry mass, it's pretty weedy, so we want to be trying to go as much of the altitude taken care of with the rapiers, and then, you know, to provide as much time as we can to circularize with the nuclear engines. Admittedly, you know, it wasn't the best ascent. I didn't end up with much delta V. Well, I ended up with over 4,000 meters per second, so I knew it was enough for the mission, but I know I could have probably done a more efficient ascent if I really put my mind to it. But it's not needed for the MUN. Again, this was designed for Juna, so it has a little bit more extra delta V than it potentially needs for a MUN mission. So any perfectionists among you might be disappointed that I didn't get quite as much delta V as I perhaps could have done if I had, you know, paid a bit more attention to flying this craft. But look at that, we actually had a pretty high periapsis after our ascent, which it doesn't happen very often, so it's nice to see it when it happens. Only going to be 15 meters per second for our burn to circularize, and you can see it's only going to be 1 second for the burn itself. Now, from this point forward, something went wrong with the maneuver nodes, and they stopped working after this burn here, as in I could still make maneuver nodes and execute the burns, but the actual estimated burn time and projected delta V cost were wrong. I'm guessing because the game got confused, because this craft is only one stage, so all the rapiers and the nuclear engines share the same stage. Now, the rapiers have been manually deactivated, but I didn't think the game realized this. So as you can see as I'm creating my maneuver node to get to the MUN, you can see this is going to be 856.1 meters per second, which is, you know, well within our capabilities because we have 4,104 meters per second. But the game, if you look at the in-game delta V readout on the left-hand side by, you know, underneath the 0 for the stage 0, it says we've only got 76 meters per second. So I think the game thinks that the rapiers are our sole source of propulsion. So sadly, we've had to you're going to have to look at the Kerbal engineer readouts to see our true delta V rally, of course. Now, with this, of course, the estimated burn time was incorrect, so I had to sort of guess how long this burn would take and then plan when I'd start burning accordingly. I've said before that you want to take the estimated burn time, cut it in half, and then you take that value, and when that is the time to maneuver node, that's when you start burning. For example, a 10-second burn, you want to start burning 5 seconds before you reach that maneuver node. So I tried to sort of guess how long this burn would take and started burning about 2.5 minutes before we reached the maneuver node, which was actually a little bit generous. We probably should have started burning a little bit before then, but whatever, you live and learn. Like I said, this thing has a bit more delta V than what we really need, so it was fine, but that was an interesting thing I had to try and guess for there. And as you can see, the game still hasn't figured it out, and it says that we're still going to run out of delta V. by the time we get to our MUN periapsis perform our circularization. So once again, I had to sort of guess how long it was going to take. Some of you may be curious, actually, why our in-game delta V has now risen to 86 meters per second when it was 75 meters per second before. The reason for this is because, and this might be obvious to some, but not necessarily to others, as we burn liquid fuel, it means we're using up liquid fuel, which means that our craft's mass is decreasing. So our delta V is effectively going up because the rapier delta V is dependent on oxidizer. So once that oxidizer runs out, they'll be unable to use any of the additional liquid fuel. So any of the liquid fuel remaining is effectively dead weight in the eyes of the rapiers and I guess the in-game delta V calculator. So as we use the nuclear engines, our delta V will paradoxically go up with the in-game readouts. That's why we're kind of having to rely on the Kerbal engineer delta V readouts. But yes, now we're doing basically the exact definition of a suicide burn. I didn't actually plan this, I just got super lucky. So just pointed retrograde relative to the surface and then left the engines at full thrust. And I always say thrust, don't I? I realised I say thrust a lot in videos because I go to say throttle and then change my mind and say thrust and end up saying thrust. In case anyone else has noticed that I say thrust a lot in lieu of, thrust or throttle or any other, normal English words. So yeah, I got almost to actual surface impact before I could actually start throttling down those nuclear engines. They were at full thrust the whole way, so it was a pretty precarious burn, but Jebediah's in the pilot seat, he knew, and he remained cool as a cucumber, which is the same colour as a Kerbal. Maybe that's why. Because they're cool as... Okay, this is rubbish. Let's move on. Got a lovely cinematic zoom in so we can, drag out the length of this video. Let's just... JK. You may have noticed, actually, even though I didn't strictly need them, I was able to utilize those Werner engines just to dampen our body slam onto the surface of the MUN once we decelerated. So I guess they did come in use. You may have noticed earlier on, actually, and I never mentioned it at the time, that I didn't actually use all of my oxidizer. The reason for this is because it's quite useful to have a little bit of oxidizer left over just so you can use the closed cycle rapiers to give yourself a little kick off the surface of any celestial body you've landed an SSTO on, because launching horizontally can be difficult, especially with engines with thrust to weight ratio as pitiful as the nuclear engines, especially because we've only got 2 as well. So I always like to use a little bit of oxidizer rapier power just to get ourselves off the ground to make sure we're definitely clear. In this case, I'm not convinced that I actually needed it, but because we've landed on this little sloped area, so we've got a nice ramp to kick us off the ground, but it's something, I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. It's a good habit to have, really. And, of course, the Werner engines use oxidizer and liquid fuel, so hey, having a little bit of oxidizer left over means you can use those Werner engines. But there we are. I talked over our Kerbals going on EVA because I felt the talking, the footage kind of did the talking for me, because talking clearly is a point I struggle with in day-to-day life. So, yep, there we are. We don't have to show you. I don't have to show you them all getting back on board. We can just fade across and get ready to perform our MUN ascent. So the first thing we can do is retract to the ladder for no reason at all other than the fact it, satisfies my gaming perfectionism. Like if this was real, we want to retract that ladder so it doesn't get bent against the ground or anything like that. I would have said gaming OCD, but I don't want to offend people that suffer from OCD, but I couldn't really think of many other colloquial alternatives. So perfectionism, obsessiveness, I don't know. Here we are taking off, and we can kick off with the rapiers. You can see there that we probably could have cleared the ground anyway, but just to be safe, we can get really, really high off the ground using the rapiers, and it rockets our surface velocity to over 150 meters per second, so we can definitely get nice and high off the surface. Of course, now they've burned out. We're only using the nuclear engines again, so our thrust weight ratio is not great. So we're going to hold a fairly steep angle of attack compared to what a lot of MUN ascents look like, which is basically flying flat immediately. Because this thing is very heavy and slow, we want to hold a fairly steep nose up, at least until our apoapsis is at a fairly high height. Just look at the time to apoapsis marker on the Kerbal engineer readouts. If it starts getting too low, you want to point a little bit steeper. Now, I must apologise at this point. Some of you may have already noticed this, that the sound in the recording somehow got cut off. So for the rest of the video, you're going to only have my wonderful voice to stimulate your earbuds. there is no sound for the game, unfortunately. Though most of it is just the burning of nuclear engines, which isn't that exciting, admittedly. So hopefully it's not going to cause too much of a detrimental effect on the quality of this video, which was otherwise flawless, I'm sure. Hey, look at this! Spoiler alert! I saw a monarch on our ascent, so that's kind of cool. There it is there. That was that. And then we can time warp up to our apoapsis to perform our circularization burn. And it would seem that the nav ball suddenly started working again. And by nav ball, I mean, of course, the maneuver node burn time indicator seems to have started working again. I did cut the footage halfway through. Like, I did a bit. I woke up really early naturally, so I just did a bit of casual Kerbal space program as you do before work. And then I went to work, of course. And then I came back from work and did the rest of the video. That's also when the audio got corrupted, so I don't know what I did in the interim. So that might have been why just rebooting Kerbal Space Program fixed the issue. I don't know. That's the only... I ain't no programmer. I'm not sure what actually caused the issue, but I'm glad that it's fixed it nonetheless. Now we're just going to do our burn to perform our Mun escape and, of course, get ourselves on a Kerbin atmospheric encounter. We are getting a bit low in the Delta V department, but it's fine because we can do the rest of our apoapsis lowering using Kerbin's atmosphere. So we're going to lower our periapsis to not too low an altitude because we don't want to burn up on entry. We don't have the convenience of having a heat shield with this thing, so we don't want to expose it to too high a heating because it will burn up. He says, time warp. I got a bit aggressive with the time warp feature there, and we ended up zooming down and entering the thick atmosphere before I had a chance to retract the solar panels, but luckily I was able to quickly smash that number 5 action group on the keyboard to get them retracted, just like I would recommend smashing that like and subscribe button. That's right, guys. People tell me that this actually works, that you should actually always tell people to smash that like button and subscribe. So there you go. I think, you know, almost when this video is over, I'm now recommended to smash that like button. But I guess it's better than what most people do, which is where they ask for like and subscribe and all that before the video has even begun. I hope at this point this has been a satisfactory piece of free content for you guys. Yeah, so the subsequent air brakes from our first one were a little bit more successful. I didn't end up losing control of the craft and have it flip. I was basically not worrying about controlling it. I was just focusing on making sure the solar panels retracted safely, so it kind of flipped. Once ships flip with all those heavy engines at the back, they tend to just continue rolling. But as long as you keep this thing kind of on a sensible plane, as in nose forward, it shouldn't really flip too easily. But yeah, once we had our apoapsis nice and low, 75 kilometers, that was a pretty, well-timed thing. We circularized quickly just so we could better plot our Kerbin descent in such a way that we would end up encountering the Kerbal Space Center, which I find, you want to have your orbit line, your periapsis disappear, and your orbit line ends at that little peninsula across the sea from the Kerbal Space Center. If you're coming from this direction, of course. If you're in a retrograde orbit, obviously that wouldn't work. But for a prograde orbit, which I guess is most people's orbits, that's just the general trajectory I aim for. Obviously, there are other things to consider, like the steepness of your re-entry and things like that. But as a general rough rule of thumb, that's kind of what I aim for. Not too much of an issue if you were to undershoot or overshoot too much with this thing, because we have, a lot of, almost 1,000 units of liquid fuel remaining, and the rapiers will work with once we're in the atmosphere because they can use the oxidizer, oxygen from the air in lieu of oxidizer from the fuel tanks, and we can just fly our way back to the Kerbal Space Center using engines. However, I always try and glide my way back because some people might be re-entering with less fuel than me, so I always want to show that you can quite easily glide to the Kerbal Space Center if you need to. However, you can see, actually, I didn't realize at the time, but looking at the staging indicator now, I can see that the parachute's deployed. I think what happened was when I was on the surface of the Mun, I couldn't remember which action group I bound the air brakes to because I wanted to just retract them when I used the brakes of the wheels. But I think I might have accidentally clicked the action group I set to toggle the parachutes. So the parachutes deployed whilst I was on the Mun, and I didn't notice, and now they, automatically deployed once we entered the atmosphere. So did some slightly unwanted slowing down there, and then my piloting skills kind of meant that I undershot the runway a bit, but I guess it worked out okay because, as I said earlier, we can use the engines to get ourselves nice and close to the runway, which is what I'm doing here. And it didn't end up consuming that much fuel on our approach. So it was all fine. It was fine in the end, guys. Don't worry. So yeah, I guess I could have set the buildings as my target, but I'm so used to flying on, like, just looking at the screen at this point that I didn't bother. So there's our lovely runway approach. I don't think any of our curve was blacked out as well on re-entry, which is always a bonus. It's not a guarantee to not black out on Lowne Aerospace air flights, but on this occasion, it was fine. Like I said, air flights. I meant to say space flights, but we're going to continue rolling the commentary because the video is almost over and I have dinner to cook. I'm very hungry. I've said it. Okay? Shoot me. I know, but for real, guys, though, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's nice to get back into the pilot seat of an SSTO, which is something I don't do as much as I used to back in the day. But that was it. Obviously, there's craft file in the description if you'd like to fly this for yourself, but on screen there are some links on the left-hand side as a video chosen for you by YouTube's recommendation algorithm, and on the right-hand side was one. It's just my most recent upload. On the left-hand side, there's also a link to subscribe. Smash that like button, of course, as I said earlier, if you want to. There's also a link to Patreon as well. And in the description, there are links to things like Instagram, Twitter, merchandise, all that good stuff. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and goodbye.